What if a federal rule that has controlled certain firearm suppressors for more than 90 years suddenly stopped being enforceable? That is essentially what has happened in Texas, and gun rights advocates are already celebrating what they call one of the biggest Second Amendment victories in decades. But there's a major detail here that could determine just how far this ruling actually goes. The controversy centers on the National Firearms Act of 1934, a law that created special federal controls over certain firearms and accessories, including suppressors, along with short-barreled rifles and short-barreled shotguns. For decades, those items have been subject to federal registration and approval requirements. But on August 5, U.S. District Judge James Wesley Hendrix ruled that key parts of those requirements could no longer be enforced after Congress eliminated the federal making and transfer taxes on the affected items. And that decision didn't just stay inside a courtroom. Once the court's order took effect, gun rights groups moved quickly. Gun Owners of America and Silencer Shop said two gun owners, Brandon Herrera and Texas State Representative Wes Verdell, completed suppressor transfers in Leander, Texas, shortly after midnight Thursday without going through the traditional NFA registration and approval process. GOA described those as the first such lawful transfers without NFA registration since the law was enacted in 1934. For supporters, this was more than a symbolic moment. They argue that the federal government had relied on its taxing authority to justify the NFA's regulatory system, and once Congress reduced the relevant tax to $0, that constitutional foundation disappeared. Gun Owners of America called the ruling historic, while Representative Andrew Clyde described it as a monumental Second Amendment victory. But here's where the legal story gets much more complicated. The judge did not simply erase the entire National Firearms Act nationwide. The injunction was limited to the plaintiffs, their members, and customers covered by the court's order. The court also declined to issue a nationwide injunction. That means the ruling is extremely significant, but it does not automatically mean every gun owner in America can ignore the federal NFA requirements. The case itself grew out of a major change Congress made in 2025. President Donald Trump signed the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which reduced the long-standing $200 NFA making and transfer taxes to $0 for suppressors, short-barreled shotguns and certain other covered weapons, effective January 1, 2026. Gun rights organizations then argued that if the tax had disappeared, the federal registration and approval system built around collecting and enforcing that tax could no longer stand on the same constitutional basis. The Justice Department disagreed with that argument. Federal officials maintained that the remaining regulations could still be supported through other congressional powers, including regulation of interstate commerce. Judge Hendrix ultimately rejected that position in the challenged context, concluding that Congress's elimination of the tax changed the constitutional foundation of the regulations. And then came the development that made this story even bigger. The Justice Department did not appeal before the court's deadline passed, allowing the order to take effect. That means, for now, the ruling is operational. But it would be a mistake to call this case completely finished. An appeal could still potentially be pursued, and the precise scope of the ruling remains critically important. There is another important point that can easily get lost in the political headlines. Judge Hendrix did not decide that every restriction involving these firearms violates the Second Amendment. In fact, the judge specifically said that efforts to make the NFA constitutional would have to come from Congress rather than the court. So this case was largely about the government's constitutional authority to maintain these particular requirements after the relevant taxes were reduced to $0. That distinction matters because the consequences could extend far beyond one Texas firearms dealer. If the ruling survives future legal challenges, it could reshape how the federal government regulates suppressors and certain short-barreled firearms, potentially forcing Congress to rethink how those rules are written and justified. And because the case involves a federal statute that has been part of America's firearms framework since the 1930s, the legal and political battle could become much bigger from here. Gun rights advocates see the moment as proof that decades-old federal restrictions can finally be challenged. Gun control organizations, meanwhile, have warned that removing these requirements could weaken safeguards surrounding firearms that have historically received additional federal scrutiny. So the biggest question now isn't simply whether a Texas judge struck down part of a 92-year-old regulatory system. The real question is what happens next. Will the Justice Department continue to leave the ruling unchallenged? Will another court take a different position? And could this eventually force the Supreme Court to weigh in on the constitutional limits of the National Firearms Act? For now, one thing is clear. A law that seemed almost untouchable for generations has suddenly become the center of one of the most consequential gun rights battles in America. And whatever happens next could determine whether this remains a narrow Texas court victory, or becomes the beginning of a much broader transformation of federal gun regulation. If you found this update helpful, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to Unix Media, and turn on notifications so you never miss the latest news. Thanks for watching.